I remember that day at the shooting range as if it were yesterday. It was a hot day. The sun was at its peak, and the light shone intensely on the worn asphalt. The smell of gunpowder and dry earth filled the air, and the sound of gunfire echoed in my ears. It had been a few months since I joined the unit, and I was still getting used to the training routine. Military life wasn't easy, but I chose it because I needed direction, a purpose. I had the dream of serving my country, of being part of something bigger than myself. It was lunchtime when we were ordered back to the shooting range for one last practice session. The captain always insisted that precision was key to saving lives. As we walked toward the firing lines, my comrades joked and laughed, but I felt a knot in my stomach. Something in the air told me that day would be different. When we arrived, I saw the targets placed at a distance. They were paper figures simulating human silhouettes, designed for soldiers to practice their shots. I settled into my position and waited for the signal to begin. A burst of gunfire erupted and concentration took over me. The echo of bullets bounced off the walls of the range, and my eyes fixed on the target. That's when I saw her. A woman walking among the targets as if nothing were happening. Her white dress fluttered gently in the breeze, and her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders. At first glance, she seemed unharmed, and the image became etched in my mind. How could she be there? The area was restricted, and no civilian should be on the range during training. "Ceasefire!" I shouted, raising my hand in an attempt to get my comrades' attention. But the noise of the bullets and the soldiers' shouts deafened me. While the shooting continued, the woman kept walking among the targets, completely ignoring the danger. Confusion overtook me. Why didn't anyone else see her? With my heart pounding, I dropped my weapon and began walking toward her. My comrades kept firing, but each step I took filled me with an inexplicable unease. Was it a trick of the light? Was I hallucinating? I couldn't understand why she was so calm as bullets whizzed around her. "Hey!" I called out, but she didn't stop. The distance between us shortened, but I still felt that strange mix of curiosity and fear. "Get out of there! It's dangerous!" But her eyes, empty and lifeless, stared at me. The closer I got, the blurrier her image became, as if a fog was beginning to cover her. And then, when I was only a few meters away, she disappeared. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the spot where she had been. The laughter and gunfire of my comrades seemed to have vanished. Only bullet holes in the targets remained, marks from the exercise. I looked around, dazed, trying to understand what had happened. "Where is the woman?" I asked out loud, but no one seemed to hear me. Some soldiers were still firing, oblivious to what I had witnessed. I returned to the group, feeling the weight of reality crushing me. "Did anyone else see that woman?" I asked, almost pleading. My comrades looked at me confused. "What woman?" one of them replied, shrugging. The captain gave me an inquisitive look, as if questioning my sanity, but I couldn't have imagined everything. She had been there, right in front of me. "Come on, it's just the heat," one of my comrades said, trying to calm me. "Sometimes we see strange things at the shooting range." I couldn't understand it. I wasn't a beginner. I had been in enough exercises to know what was real and what wasn't. Something dark had slipped into the shadows of the range, and I had seen it. Days passed, and despite my efforts to forget, the image of the woman continued to haunt me. People began to notice my unease. At night, I woke up in cold sweats, trapped in a cycle of disturbing dreams. The woman was always there, staring at me with those empty eyes. My comrades started talking about my mental state, and some even mocked me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't crazy. There was something in the air, a presence, and I felt it closer every day. One night, while we shared stories in the barracks, I decided to open up. "I had a strange experience at the shooting range," I began, and the murmurs ceased. I saw a woman walking among the targets, and no one else seemed to notice. The laughter turned into serious looks. "Really? Are you sure it wasn't a mirage?" one of the soldiers asked, his eyes filled with disbelief. "No, I saw it. I wasn't crazy. She was there," I insisted, frustration evident in my voice. "I don't know what it means, but something isn't right." Some murmured among themselves, and the captain finally intervened. "Listen, the stress of training can make the mind play tricks. Don't get carried away by superstitions." That night I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling and feeling the pressure in my chest. The image of the woman returned, this time clearer, more intense. I decided I had to face what I had seen. The next day, I returned to the shooting range, this time alone. I knew I had to find answers. When I arrived, the calm of the place enveloped me. The sun shone brightly and the targets were there, silent and waiting for me. I took a deep breath and moved forward, the echo of my steps resonating in the silence. I was determined to find any clue that would help me understand what I had experienced. I began inspecting the targets, searching for any trace of the woman. While examining the area, I noticed something strange on the ground. A footprint that seemed out of place. It was deeper than the marks left by the boots we usually wore on the range. I crouched to inspect it more closely and a chill ran down my spine. The footprint looked fresh, as if someone had been there recently. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice echoed in the solitude of the place. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but there was no sign of life. Just me and the overwhelming silence. The knot in my stomach tightened as the atmosphere grew more oppressive. Then I heard a whisper behind me. I turned quickly, but there was only emptiness. "Who's there?" I shouted, feeling my heart race uncontrollably. The sensation of being watched overwhelmed me. I could feel it. I looked back at the targets, and there she was again, the woman, standing in the middle of the targets. "No, no!" I screamed, taking a step back. She stood there, motionless, and then darkness seemed to spread around her. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just her empty gaze piercing through me. "Get away!" I shouted, feeling my sanity slipping away. I stepped back, tripping over something on the ground, and fell, covering my head. "Leave me alone." The image of the woman blurred, and then she vanished. The silence was absolute. I got up, trying to compose myself. The range was calm, and the sun shone as if nothing had happened. But I knew something was wrong. That wouldn't be the last time I'd see her. The following days were a nightmare. The image of the woman kept appearing in my dreams and at every corner of the base. My comrades noticed my distress, and although I tried to explain, no one understood. I began avoiding the shooting range, but I couldn't escape what I had seen. One night, while in the barracks, a comrade approached me. "I heard you've been seeing things. There are stories about the shooting range, legends of soldiers who died in the past," he said seriously. "They say some souls don't find peace and remain trapped here." My eyes widened. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a chill run through me. "Some say the place is cursed, that there are spirits wandering here, seeking vengeance or justice." My mind filled with images of the woman, her gaze, how she had been there, unharmed and oblivious to danger. The next day, I decided I had to know more. I returned to the shooting range, but this time with a group of soldiers who shared my unease. I told them about the woman, and some laughed, but they soon realized I was serious. "Let's find her," one of them said with a mix of bravery and curiosity. When we arrived, the air felt heavy. We started shooting, each focused on their targets. But as the day went on, the visions intensified. The woman appeared and disappeared among the targets, more present than ever. "Cease fire," I shouted again, but my words were drowned out by the noise. When we finally decided to search for her, the atmosphere changed. The wind blew stronger, as if nature itself was warning us. We walked toward where I had first seen her, but when we arrived, there was no trace. Only bullet holes and the echo of our breaths. I looked at my comrades, and their expressions turned somber. "Maybe we should leave," one of them suggested, sensing the tension in the air. But something told me we had to stay. I couldn't let the woman remain just an illusion. "No, we need to stay a bit longer," I replied with determination. The silence became deafening. We split up, searching in different directions. Then I heard a whisper again, a familiar echo resonating in my mind. "Come," a soft, almost hypnotic voice said. I followed the sound, and before I knew it, I found myself in the center of the targets, surrounded by bullet holes. The woman appeared again, this time closer. I saw her smile, a smile that froze my blood. "Why are you here?" I asked, feeling trapped in her presence. "Come with me," she replied, her voice like a siren's song. My comrades approached, scared, but the woman's figure hypnotized them. "We can't go with you," one of them said, but the fear in his voice was evident. She looked at them, and in an instant, everything changed. The silhouettes of my comrades began to fade, as if the air was swallowing them. "No!" I screamed, trying to reach them, but it was too late. The woman turned to me, her penetrating cold gaze fixed on me. "Only those who seek the truth can see me," she said softly. "Come and discover it." Unable to resist, I followed her. We walked among the targets, and in an instant, everything went dark. I woke up suddenly in the barracks, sweaty and trembling. My comrades were there, looking at me with concern. "You need to stop thinking about it," they said. "It's not real, just your mind playing tricks on you." "But I saw it," I replied, my voice shaky. "It wasn't a hallucination." As I spoke, I realized something had changed. The fear had disappeared, but a new uncertainty settled within me. What had happened at the shooting range? The image of the woman kept haunting me, but now it was different. I no longer saw her as a threat, but as a presence, a reminder of the fragility of life and death. As the days passed, I began to understand that the woman wasn't a ghost, but a representation of the souls trapped on the range. Deep down, I knew my experience had been a gift. Military life wasn't just a job, it was a way to honor those who had fallen, the souls seeking peace. As I watched my comrades laugh and talk, I understood that I didn't have to fear the unknown. I had to learn from it. Every time I returned to the shooting range, I felt her presence, but I was no longer afraid. The woman had shown me something I couldn't ignore. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I thought I heard her voice whispering in the wind, reminding me that there's always more than meets the eye. That's how I learned to live with the echo of her presence. It wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. And although life on the shooting range remained tough, I knew that each shot was a tribute, a connection to what had been and what would always be. In every bullet, there was a story to tell, a memory that should never be forgotten. Life at the military base in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, wasn't anything extraordinary. Long days, exhausting drills, and a routine that repeated like a well-oiled machine. I'd been here for quite some time, maybe too long. My days consisted of endless marches, night guards, and hollow conversations with my comrades. For many, this lifestyle was dull. For me, though, the routine was a refuge. It kept my mind occupied, away from the dark thoughts that sometimes crept into the silence. Unlike many other soldiers, I didn't come from a military family. I grew up in a small town in Tennessee, with no idea what a military base was, let alone what it meant to serve. It was a sudden decision, an escape from a life that suffocated me, and before I knew it, I was here, trapped in a reality that didn't let me breathe. I never thought anything out of the ordinary would happen in this place. That changed one night. It all started with a rumor, a simple conversation among comrades that sounded more like a joke than anything else. But the first time I saw that man on the rooftop of the old building, I knew something wasn't right. "Have you seen the man on the rooftop?" Turner, one of the base's veterans, asked me one night while we were in the break room. "What are you talking about?" I replied, distracted and not very interested in the conversation. The night was calm, and after several hours on guard duty, all I wanted was a warm drink and some sleep. "The old building, the one they closed years ago. There's someone who shows up there every night right at midnight." Turner spoke in a low voice, almost whispering, as if he were afraid something or someone might hear him. "Don't start with nonsense," I said, a little annoyed by how absurd it sounded. But he didn't seem to be joking. In fact, his expression was serious, something I hadn't seen from him the entire time I'd known him. "It's not nonsense," he insisted. "I've seen him. He's there, standing, looking toward the base. He never moves, just watches." Turner wasn't the type to get scared easily. He'd been on more missions than most of us and always kept his cool. But that night, something in his face made me doubt. I dismissed it at the time, though his words lingered in my mind for days. The building Turner mentioned was on the southern edge of the base, isolated from the rest. It had been closed years ago, supposedly due to structural issues. No one went near that area, and the few times I passed by, all I saw were sealed windows and doors locked with chains. But one night, during one of my rounds, I decided to take a look. I was doing my usual patrol, flashlight in hand, when suddenly I felt a chill run down my spine. Something made me turn toward the old building. At first I didn't see anything, just the dark silhouette of the building against the night sky. But then I saw him, a figure standing on the rooftop. "That can't be," I muttered to myself, rubbing my eyes as if that could erase what I was seeing. But he was still there, motionless, arms crossed, his head slightly tilted downward, staring into the base. For a moment, my breathing stopped. The figure didn't seem human, not entirely. He didn't move, but something about his posture made me feel watched. I quickened my pace, unable to take my eyes off the rooftop. In the blink of an eye, the figure vanished. I returned to the barracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't say anything to my comrades. I didn't want them to think I'd lost my mind. But I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Every night, without fail, I passed by the old building during my rounds, and each time the figure was there, standing, watching. Finally, one night I decided to get closer. I couldn't take the curiosity anymore. I have to know what that is, I told myself, though part of me knew I might regret it. I climbed the stairs to the rooftop, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. Each step felt heavier, as if the air itself became denser the closer I got. When I reached the rooftop door, I paused for a moment. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I pushed the door open cautiously. The hinge creaked, a sharp sound that shattered the night silence. On the other side of the door, there was nothing. The rooftop was empty. I walked toward the edge, hoping to find some clue, something to explain what I'd been seeing. But there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. Just the cold night wind. I was about to head back when I felt it, a presence behind me. I spun around quickly, but there was nothing. Yet the air felt different, heavy, as if something invisible surrounded me. Suddenly I heard a whisper, barely audible but clear. "You shouldn't have come." A cold wave swept over my body. I saw no one, but fear consumed me. I bolted down the stairs, not stopping until I was safely inside the barracks. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words kept echoing in my mind. Over the following days, I tried to avoid that part of the base, but I couldn't ignore it for long. Other soldiers began talking about the man on the rooftop. They said they'd been seeing him more often, always standing, always watching. One day I couldn't hold back and confronted Turner. "What do you think that is?" I asked. Turner gave me a grim look. "I don't know," he said, "but I've seen him for years. Some say he was an officer who died here long ago. Others think it's something older. Whatever it is, it's not good." After that conversation, more soldiers started sharing their stories. We'd all seen the figure on the rooftop, but no one had answers. One night, a group of us decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and a sense of camaraderie, we headed toward the building. We entered through the back door, and as we moved through the dark hallways, an overwhelming sense of unease gripped me. We heard strange noises, whispers in the shadows, but none of us stopped. We made our way to the stairs leading to the rooftop. No one spoke, but we all felt the same thing, a presence, something that didn't belong in this world. We climbed to the rooftop, and there he was, standing with his arms crossed, looking out at the base. But this time, he didn't vanish. We froze, unable to move. Then suddenly, the figure turned toward us. He had no face, just an endless darkness where his eyes should have been. "Leave this place," a voice said, though none of us had spoken. It was as if the darkness itself was speaking. We stood there for what felt like hours until one of my comrades let out a strangled scream and ran toward the stairs. The rest of us followed, stumbling in our haste to get as far away from that thing as possible. From that night on, no one mentioned the man on the rooftop again, but we all knew he was still there, watching, waiting. I'm not someone who's easily impressed. After all, I've seen the worst of the worst during my military service. Missions abroad, the chaos of conflict zones, and the aftermath of battles have hardened me. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced at that old hospital base in the heart of Missouri. I'm not superstitious, never have been. But what I saw that night in the abandoned military hospital still haunts me, and no matter how hard I try, I can't find a rational explanation. It all started when I was assigned to oversee a cleanup operation at a facility that had been closed since the 1970s. The hospital, known as Hamilton Military Hospital, had been used during World War II to treat soldiers returning injured from the European front. Over time, the place had been forgotten, leaving behind only vague rumors about its history. Some said the hospital had been abruptly shut down after a strange accident, but no one knew exactly what had happened. When I received the order to inspect the hospital, I treated it like any other routine task. I'd had a rough couple of months in service, and honestly, the change of pace was welcome. I didn't expect to find anything unusual. The mission was simple: survey the place, take note of anything relevant, and report my findings. From the moment I set foot in the building, something felt off. The peeling walls, the long, dark hallways, and the lingering dampness in the air gave it a desolate atmosphere. My team and I walked through the halls of the main building, where old gurneys were still lined up as if someone had abandoned them there decades ago and never returned to retrieve them. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of our boots in the corridors. "This place is dead," one of my teammates joked, trying to lighten the mood. "No wonder no one set foot here in decades." I didn't respond. There was something I couldn't shake, a constant feeling of being watched. I knew the place was empty, sealed off for years, but my instincts told me otherwise. We spent hours combing through the upper floors of the hospital. Nothing out of the ordinary, just ruins and accumulated dust. Then, on the third floor, something changed. When we entered one of the hallways, I saw a faint light flickering at the far end. I thought it was an old lamp still functioning somehow. But then I saw her. A figure, dressed in the classic white nurse's uniform from the 1940s, moving slowly back and forth in a patient room. I froze in place, my teammates taking a few more steps before noticing I had stopped. "What's wrong?" one of them asked. I pointed toward the room. "Do you see that?" They all looked but didn't react. They couldn't see her. She was there, walking with a disturbingly calm demeanor, adjusting sheets and checking empty beds as if caring for invisible patients. My teammates exchanged puzzled looks, clearly confused by my behavior. "There's nothing there, man. Let's keep moving. This place is playing tricks on you." But I knew what I'd seen. The nurse was still there, tending to patients as if the hospital was full. Her face was partially covered by a mask, but what little skin was visible was pale, almost translucent. There was something unnerving about the precision of her movements, as if she were trapped in an eternal routine. Somehow I managed to tear my gaze away and continue the inspection, but the sense that something was deeply wrong in that place never left me. That night, while we camped near the hospital, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back alone. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps the need to prove to myself that it was just an illusion brought on by exhaustion. I re-entered the hospital, this time by myself. The silence was even heavier, and every step I took echoed like thunder in the stillness. When I reached the third floor, everything appeared the same. The gurneys were still in place, the dust covered everything, and there was no sign of life. But then I saw her again. The same nurse. She was bent over a bed, adjusting a sheet as if preparing it for a patient who wasn't there. This time I approached her, my eyes fixed on her every move. My heart was pounding, and though every instinct told me to leave, I kept moving forward. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I'd like. She didn't respond. She didn't even look at me. She just continued her task as if I didn't exist. I got close enough to notice the details of her uniform, the yellowish stains that looked like old blood on the edges of her apron. The air around her was freezing, much colder than the rest of the hospital. Finally, I gathered the courage to touch her shoulder. It was like touching emptiness. My hand went right through her body, and at that moment, she stopped. Her head slowly turned toward me, her empty, dark eyes meeting mine. A chill ran down my spine. "They need help," she murmured, her voice distant and filled with sorrow. I stumbled back, tripping over a gurney as I tried to get away. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. Before I could react, she went back to her task, ignoring me completely. I ran out of the hospital without looking back. When I returned to camp, I didn't say a word to my teammates. Who would believe me? I wasn't even sure I believed myself. But I knew I couldn't go back to that place. Something in that hospital was trapped, and that nurse, whoever she was doomed to continue caring for patients who were no longer there. The next day, we received orders to withdraw. The cleanup operation was canceled without explanation, and no one ever mentioned Hamilton Military Hospital again. But I haven't been able to forget it. Sometimes I dream of that nurse, her pale figure walking the empty halls, always working, always tending. And though I've tried to rationalize what I saw, a part of me knows it was real. That hospital holds secrets that should have been buried with the soldiers who died there. Sometimes I wonder if that nurse at some point will be waiting for me in those dark hallways, ready to tend to me as one of the patients who never made it out of Hamilton Military Hospital. And perhaps when it's my turn, there will be no escape. I look out at the horizon now, and even though years have passed since that night in the desert, the memory remains as vivid as if it happened yesterday. Of all the things I experienced during my military service, nothing has marked me as deeply as that mission. That figure in the black trench coat still haunts me, like a specter that never dissipates, always lingering at the edge of my mind. It had been a scorching day in the Nevada desert near the base where we were stationed. We had been sent on a routine operation, a nighttime reconnaissance mission. It was supposed to be simple, just another drill in a terrain we already knew well. But when night falls in the desert, everything changes. I had been in the unit for several months, nothing particularly remarkable, just another soldier following orders, doing my duty, and trying not to stand out too much. I had always kept to myself, observing more than speaking, and that habit had helped me keep a low profile. My life up to that point had been fairly ordinary. I thought I had seen it all. But that night in the middle of the desert, something I could never explain crossed my path. It was past midnight when we deployed. The desert air had cooled, and the sand beneath my boots crunched with every step. The stars shone above us, but the darkness was overwhelming. My comrades and I advanced in silence, following orders to stay alert and cover all angles. The mission was simple: secure a perimeter and monitor the area for any movement. As we walked, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a hallucination brought on by fatigue. In the distance near the horizon, I saw a figure. It was a man. I knew that immediately. But what surprised me was his attire. He wore a black trench coat, something entirely inappropriate for the desert. He wasn't close, but not so far away that he was indistinguishable. He moved with slow, almost floating steps. No one else seemed to notice. I approached one of my comrades walking a few steps ahead. I called him quietly. "Did you see that?" "See what?" he replied without stopping, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "There's someone out there on the horizon." I pointed to where I had seen him, but the figure was gone. I stood there, confused. My comrade raised an eyebrow and smirked faintly. "You're seeing ghosts. There's nothing out here but sand and rocks. Keep moving." I didn't argue. It seemed foolish, and the last thing I wanted was to become the butt of jokes for the rest of the mission. But something inside me remained uneasy. We continued for several more hours. The radio stayed silent and everything seemed calm. The cold began to seep into my bones, typical of the desert at night. Suddenly, I felt that strange sensation again. Instinctively, I lifted my gaze, and there he was again. The same figure in the black trench coat, closer this time but still walking toward the horizon, always in the same direction as if nothing could stop him. I stopped for a moment. My heart pounded and my breathing grew heavier. This time, I wouldn't stay quiet. "Stop," I said, and the group halted. My superior glared at me, but before he could reprimand me, I pointed again toward the horizon. "There he is, the man in the trench coat. This can't be a coincidence. He's been walking for hours, always in the same direction." My comrades looked where I pointed, but their faces showed confusion. "There's nothing there," one of them said, but I could see him clearly. The figure kept moving, step by step, slow but steady. My superior didn't want to waste time on discussions. "We don't have time for this. Stay in formation. If you see something, report it, but we can't stop for hallucinations." But it wasn't a hallucination. I knew it wasn't. It had to be real. I decided that if no one else could see him, I would follow him alone. Something compelled me to do it. A morbid curiosity I couldn't ignore. I waited for the first opportunity to separate from the group. I pretended to check my equipment, and when they were far enough ahead, I began walking in the direction of the figure. The closer I got, the clearer he became, but I still couldn't catch up to the man in the black trench coat. He seemed to move at my pace, always maintaining the same distance. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping for some reaction. But the figure didn't stop or turn his head. He just kept walking toward the horizon. I quickened my pace, almost running, but no matter how much effort I put in, he was always the same distance ahead. Frustration and fear began to take hold of me. What the hell was that? I was alone in the middle of the desert, chasing something my comrades couldn't see. My breathing grew more labored, and the desert's chill was replaced by a creeping sense of unease that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Stop!" I shouted again. My voice echoed into the vastness of the desert, but the man kept walking. Then I heard a whisper behind me. I spun around quickly, but there was no one there. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Something was very wrong. Suddenly, the whisper grew louder, as if the wind itself were speaking to me, though there was no wind. "Don't follow," it seemed to say. But my body wouldn't listen. Something stronger than fear drove me to keep chasing the figure. I don't know how long I walked. It could have been minutes or maybe hours. The desert around me began to change. It no longer felt like the familiar terrain of Nevada. The dunes grew taller, the sky darker. My flashlight began to flicker. What scared me the most was that the ground no longer felt solid beneath my feet. Every step I took felt like the earth was sinking slightly, as if I were walking on a soft, almost liquid surface. The figure in the trench coat kept moving, always at the same distance, unbothered. However, I began to notice something strange. As I advanced, the horizon seemed to draw closer. And with it came a sensation of emptiness. Not just the loneliness of the desert, but something deeper, as if everything around me was being consumed by a darkness I couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, the figure stopped. My legs trembled as I saw him standing there, motionless. A wave of irrational panic washed over me. I knew I shouldn't approach any closer, but my body wouldn't obey. Every time I tried to step back, an invisible force pushed me forward. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The next thing I remember, I was standing alone in the sand, miles away from where I should have been. My comrades found me after tracking my footprints, but I never told them what had really happened. No one would believe me. The man never appeared again, but even now as I write this, I feel his presence, always walking toward the horizon, waiting for someone to follow. The cold was always a constant companion on winter nights at Fort Lewis, Washington. It wasn't the kind of cold that simply made you shiver. It was the type that seemed to crawl under your skin, seep into your bones, and linger there like a persistent shadow. I don't recall exactly when I got used to it, but after several winters you adapt, you become numb, or so I thought. My life on the base was monotonous but structured. I would wake up before dawn, train, stand guard when it was my turn, and repeat the cycle. There was something comforting in that routine, something that made me feel safe, as if the base's walls and the chain of command shielded me from anything that might exist beyond them. Until I saw him. That night I was on guard duty, walking along the east runway of the base. It was a relatively deserted area at that hour, with only the sound of the wind whistling through the empty hangars and the occasional echo of my boots on the asphalt. Sometimes, if the weather was clear, I could hear the distant noises of the city across the river. But that night, there was nothing. Only the wind and the sensation that something was out of place. I looked toward the horizon, past the barracks and the training grounds, toward the hills beyond. That's when I saw him for the first time. A solitary figure walking near the fence, wearing a long coat that swayed slightly in the breeze. At first glance, I thought it was one of ours. Maybe an officer on a nighttime patrol, but something about the way he moved unsettled me. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something but without any urgency. "What the hell?" I muttered, adjusting the belt on my uniform. I decided to approach. If someone was in the perimeter without authorization, I had to investigate. The figure didn't seem to notice me, which gave me an advantage. I quickened my pace, trying to close the distance between us, but the closer I thought I was, the farther he seemed to get. "Hey," I yelled, using the authoritative tone we were taught in training. "Stop right there." There was no response. The figure continued, without turning, without showing the slightest sign of having heard me. Something wasn't right. I knew it was cold, but at that moment the temperature seemed to drop several degrees all at once, as if the presence of that man had brought winter with him. I picked up my pace, almost running, but when I reached the spot where I'd last seen him, he was already gone. Only silence and the enveloping darkness of the perimeter remained. I stopped dead, looking around, searching for any sign, a shadow, anything that would reveal his location. But there was nothing. And the strangest thing, no footprints. I crouched, carefully examining the ground. The terrain was damp, he should have left some trace. But the spot where I'd seen him was completely untouched, as if no one had passed through in hours. I retraced my steps, trying to stay calm. Maybe it had just been a hallucination, a trick of the light or shadows. It wasn't the first time it happened, especially on such a dark night. But when I returned to the guard shack, I couldn't resist mentioning what I'd seen. "A guy with a long coat, you say?" Sergeant Miller asked, raising an eyebrow while cleaning his rifle. "Yeah, right on the perimeter." I followed him, but he disappeared. Miller let out a dry laugh, as if he had already heard that story before. He looked at me with a mix of weariness and something else I couldn't interpret at the time. "You're not the first to see him," he finally said, "but I suggest you stop asking about him." "What are you talking about?" "There are stories, you know. Things rookies like you don't understand. Just leave it alone." I stayed silent, watching as Miller continued his task without meeting my eyes. Something in his tone made me realize there was more to what he was saying, but I didn't push it. Back at my bunk, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the man in the long coat returned to me. Something about the way he walked, the way he seemed not to belong to this place, had left me with an unease I couldn't shake. Several days passed without incident, and though I tried to focus on my duties, the man's figure wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I was alone, every time the base fell silent, I felt his presence, as if he was waiting for me in some dark corner, watching. One night, during another patrol, I saw him again. This time, he was closer, standing just at the edge of the main hangar. His long coat swayed in the wind, and though the cold was intense, it didn't seem to affect him. I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward him, determined to confront him. I yelled his name, or at least what I thought might be a name, but he didn't respond. When I reached the spot, he had vanished again. This time, however, I found something. On the ground where he had stood was an object. I crouched and picked it up. It was a small military insignia, old and rusted, almost unrecognizable. I put it in my pocket, feeling a chill run down my spine. The next day, I took the insignia to Miller. "I found this where I saw him last night," I said, placing it on the table in front of him. Miller stared at it in silence, his face hardening as if he knew exactly what it was. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "That insignia," he began, his voice lower than usual. "It belonged to a soldier who died over 20 years ago. His name was Johnson." "Johnson? What happened to him?" Miller sighed and got up from the table, walking to the window of the barracks, looking outside as if trying to remember something he had buried long ago. "Johnson disappeared one winter night during a patrol like yours. We never saw him again, but some say he's still looking for something. We never found out what happened, but those who've seen him, well, you know the story. Most prefer not to talk about it." I didn't know what to say. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, and suddenly the base didn't feel as safe anymore. Had I been seeing the ghost of a missing soldier? Was that even possible? I knew I didn't believe in such things, but after what I had seen, after finding that insignia, that night I decided not to stay on the base. I requested leave to go into town. I needed to clear my head to get away from everything that had happened. But as I drove down the road bordering the base, something stopped me in my tracks. There, a few meters ahead of me in the middle of the empty road, stood him, the man in the long coat, staring straight at me. I always thought that war left marks deeper than even death could erase. I've seen things no man should witness, but that night, that cursed night under the rain, is something I'll never forget. I had been in the Army for at least 5 years. My time in the ranks was nothing extraordinary. I wasn't the most outstanding, nor the most mediocre. I did my job, followed orders, and when the day ended, I tried to clear my mind of the things we had seen. My comrades always joked about how I managed to stay so calm, how I managed to bury the disturbing images we all carried. The truth is, I didn't. I just buried them. That night, we were at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It was one of those nights when the storm wouldn't relent. The wind lashed against the barracks windows and the rain fell with such intensity that one might swear the sky itself was collapsing on us. I didn't mind much. I was on watch, and those lonely nights, while tedious, gave me time to think about anything other than war. The base was unusually quiet. Most of the guys were sleeping or trying to, while the rest sheltered in the dining hall or the corridors waiting for the storm to pass. I was at the entrance, watching the raindrops create improvised streams in the dirt. The sound of the rain was all that could be heard, an unceasing echo that made time feel slower than it already was. That's when I saw it. A flash of light struck in the distance, briefly illuminating the road cutting through the base's perimeter. Under the light of the lightning, I saw a figure, a soldier, marching slowly through the rain. His uniform was completely soaked, clinging to his body like a second skin. But what caught my attention the most was his stride. It was rigid, mechanical, as if he felt neither the rain nor the cold. He seemed like a ghost amidst the storm. I frowned. No one should be outside in such conditions, let alone a soldier wandering aimlessly. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and stepped outside. The wind hit me immediately, drenching me in seconds, but I kept walking toward the figure. "Hey," I yelled, my voice barely audible over the roaring wind. I got no response. I quickened my pace, trying to catch up with him, but for some reason every step I took only seemed to take me farther away. The figure kept marching, unperturbed, as if he couldn't hear me. The rain grew heavier and the water reached my ankles. Somehow the ground seemed to absorb the water without forming puddles, except for one, the largest, just ahead of me. Finally, when I was just a few meters away, the soldier stopped. His body became completely still, but he didn't turn to face me. The flashlight in my hand trembled due to the cold and the nerves beginning to take hold of me. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. "Hey, stop! What are you doing out here?" I shouted again, this time with more force. I took another couple of steps, and just as I was about to touch his shoulder, the soldier began to turn slowly. My heart skipped a beat when his face came into view. There was no face. What stood before me was an empty silhouette, a shadow without features, just a figure in uniform that seemed to have been formed by the storm itself. I tried to step back, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were anchored to the ground. That's when the strangest thing happened. The puddle in front of me began to bubble, as if something was moving beneath the water. I looked down and then back at the soldier, but he was gone. The only thing left was the puddle and the uniform he had worn, floating on the surface as if the water had consumed it. My lungs seemed to collapse at that moment. I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the thunder rumbling in the sky. I turned and ran back to the base without looking back. The water splashed with every step, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. When I reached the barracks door, one of my comrades looked at me with a puzzled expression. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked. "I saw someone, a soldier. He was marching in the rain, but he disappeared," I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it? Rain can play tricks, you know," he said, letting out a nervous laugh. "Nobody in their right mind would be out there in this weather." I wanted to respond, to tell him that I had seen it, that it wasn't a hallucination, but something stopped me. I knew what I had seen, and I knew he wouldn't understand. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure marching through the storm, the water swallowing him as if he had never existed. I tried to calm myself by saying it was just a vision, an illusion brought on by fatigue, but deep down, I knew it was something more, something I couldn't explain. Over the following days, I tried to ignore what had happened, but the image of that soldier kept haunting me. I spoke with other comrades, asking if anyone had seen anything strange during the storm, but no one seemed to notice anything. Some looked at me strangely, as if I was losing my mind. Finally, I decided to investigate on my own. I combed through the base records, searching for any mention of unexplained disappearances or deaths in the area. It was one of those nights, while reviewing old files, that I found something, an incident that had occurred many years ago at the same base. A soldier had disappeared during a storm. The report said he had been on a routine march when the storm surprised him. His comrades saw him walk away in the rain, but when they tried to catch up, they only found his uniform floating in a puddle of water. No one could explain what had happened, and his body was never found. My skin crawled as I read that report. The soldier I had seen. Could it have been him? Could he be trapped in some kind of limbo, condemned to march under the rain for eternity? Since then, I avoid going out during storms. I always stay inside, far from the windows, far from the water. Every time I hear the sound of rain hitting the roof, my mind goes back to that night, and I wonder if he's still out there, marching, waiting for someone else to see him. Maybe one day he'll appear again, but this time I won't follow him.